Why are your prayers not being answered? The parable of the persistent widow introduction. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe the problem isn't that God doesn't hear your prayers, but rather that you give up on praying too soon? I know this sounds harsh, almost offensive, but before you close this video in indignation, give me just 3 minutes to show you something that could completely revolutionize your prayer life. The truth is that most people pray like someone tossing a coin into a wishing well. They make the request, wait a little, and if nothing happens, they simply move on. But what if I told you that Jesus taught exactly the opposite of this? And what if I showed you that there's a woman in the Bible who managed to bend a corrupt, heartless, and totally unjust judge using just one weapon? She simply didn't give up asking. This story isn't in some motivational self-help book, it's in the words of Jesus himself. And he told it precisely for people like you who are tired of praying without seeing results. The parable of the persistent widow is one of the shortest stories Jesus told, but it's also one of the most confronting and powerful. He didn't tell it to people who had never prayed, but to disciples who were exhausted from waiting, who had already prayed so much they didn't know what else to say, who looked to heaven and felt only silence. You know that moment when you've already cried all the tears you had, already fasted as much as you could, already done prayer campaigns, already asked everyone for prayer, and still nothing changed. That's exactly what the disciples were feeling, and it was in this context of discouragement and weariness that Jesus decided to tell this story. Not to teach prayer techniques, not to give magic formulas, but to answer the question that was burning in everyone's heart, and probably burning in yours too. Why are my prayers not being answered? Here's what you're going to discover in the next few minutes. Jesus is going to show you that God is not like this unjust judge he describes in the parable. Quite the opposite. If even a corrupt judge who had no love whatsoever, who didn't care about anyone, gave in because of the persistence of a powerless widow, how much more will a loving, just, and faithful God respond to the persistent cries of his children? The problem was never that God didn't want to answer you. The problem is that we live in a microwave faith generation, where if we don't see results in 7 days, we move on to something else. But this parable is going to teach you that there's a type of faith that Jesus still seeks on earth. A rare, precious faith that doesn't give up even when everything seems lost. And at the end of this video, you're going to have to make a choice. Either you continue praying in the superficial way most people pray, or you decide to become like that widow who simply refused to accept no as a final answer. The answer you're waiting for might be just one more prayer away. Are you ready to discover the secret of prayer that moves even the heart of an unjust judge? Spiritual context of the parable. Jesus shared this story at a time when many hearts were already tired of waiting, where many people's faith was beginning to waver in the face of heaven's apparent silence. You know that moment in life when everything seemed lost, and you look around seeking a sign, an answer, anything that shows you're not alone. That's exactly what the disciples were experiencing. They had just heard Jesus speak about difficult times that would come, about persecutions, about trials that would make many question everything they believed. And it was precisely in this heavy scenario, in this climate of uncertainty, that Jesus decided to tell this parable. It wasn't a story told to people who had never prayed, but to those who had already prayed so much that their tears could fill a river, to those who had already felt that God saw their pain, but still hadn't intervened in the expected way. The central issue wasn't whether they knew how to pray, because everyone there already knew the memorized prayers, had already spent hours on their knees pleading. The real challenge was something else, much deeper and more painful. Will you continue praying when nothing changes? Will your faith withstand the pressure of silence? Imagine that friend who lends you money without you asking, who shows up at your door when you need it most, who's always available. Now imagine that same friend suddenly stops responding to your messages. You know he exists, you know where he lives, but he simply doesn't respond anymore. It's anguishing, isn't it? Well, that's exactly the feeling many of the disciples were experiencing. And it's the same feeling you might be living through now. When God speaks to your heart about something, when He plants a promise in your soul, but days pass and nothing materializes, doubt begins to whisper, "Did you hear wrong? Did God really say that?" The widow in the parable represents each of us in our moments of greatest vulnerability. She had no political power to pressure the judge, no money to bribe him, no social influence to make him listen to her out of obligation or convenience. All she possessed was a desperate need for justice and an unshakable determination not to give up. Think about those situations in your life where you felt completely powerless, when you lost that job and no one gave you an opportunity, when the medical diagnosis came and you had no resources for treatment, when the relationship ended and you found yourself alone facing the bills and responsibilities. In those moments, you have nothing to offer God except your insistence, your persistence, your refusal to accept no as a final answer. And that's exactly where God sustained me in so many stories I've seen and lived, because He doesn't need you to be strong, influential, or perfect. Jesus was preparing His disciples for an uncomfortable truth. True faith is untested when everything is going well. But when heaven is silent, but God is working behind the scenes of your story. He knew that a time would come when many would give up, because the answer took too long, because the miracle didn't come within the expected time frame, because God heard your prayer but hasn't yet manifested the answer in the way you imagined. The parable isn't a manual on how to manipulate God to get what you want, but rather an invitation to understand that God's timing doesn't operate at the same speed as your expectations. That widow went to the judge every day, and every day she heard, "No, come back tomorrow. I don't have time for you now," but she didn't let repeated rejection define the final outcome of her story. And that's exactly what God works in silence to produce in you, a faith that doesn't depend on immediate answers. but that anchors itself in the certainty of who God is, regardless of what he's doing or not doing at the moment. Who was the widow? In that era's culture, a widow wasn't just a woman who had lost her husband. She was someone who had lost her social identity, her legal protection, and her voice in society. Think about how it works today when you try to resolve a bureaucratic problem without having the right documents, without having a lawyer, without having someone influential to intercede for you. Now multiply that difficulty by 1,000, and you'll have a small notion of what it was like to be a widow in those times. She couldn't sign contracts, couldn't testify in courts with the same weight as a man, couldn't even be heard in many situations without someone speaking for her. It was as if she had become invisible overnight, as if her existence no longer mattered to the system. And that's exactly why Jesus chose her as the protagonist of this story. Because God saw your pain and wanted to show that even those most invisible to human eyes are completely visible to divine eyes. This woman had no husband to defend her in legal matters, no adult sons who could represent her, no money saved to hire someone to fight for her rights. Humanly speaking, she was completely alone and without resources. You know that moment in life when you look around and realize you have no one to help you? When you call that friend who always said, "Count on me," and they're too busy. When you look for your family and they have their own problems. When you knock on all the doors and they all remain closed. That's exactly how this widow felt. But here's something powerful. She had something that no unjust system could take from her. It wasn't money, it wasn't influence, it wasn't beauty or eloquence. It was pure and simple persistence. When God speaks to the heart of someone who won't give up, not even hell can make that person back down. And this widow had exactly that, an unshakable refusal to accept injustice as her final destiny. Imagine the scene. Every day she woke up, got ready, and went to the court where the judge attended. Every day she faced looks of contempt, mocking laughter, malicious comments from those who thought she was wasting her time. Look at that widow again. She really doesn't give up. What an insistent and inconvenient woman. But you know what's fascinating? She didn't care about others' opinions. She wasn't there to be popular or liked. She was there because she had a right and wasn't leaving until that right was recognized. It's like that guy who lost everything in a financial scam and decided to sue those responsible even when everyone said, "Let it go. You won't get anything against them." But he didn't give up, gathered every piece of evidence, returned to court as many times as necessary, and years later saw justice being done. The widow in the parable had that same determination, and Jesus was showing that you're not alone. God is with you when you decide not to give up on what's right, even if the whole world says you're wasting your time. The most incredible thing is that Jesus doesn't present this widow as a faith superhero, as someone who fasted for 40 days or had heavenly visions every night. No, she was an ordinary person, wounded by loss, hurt by injustice, tired of being ignored. But she had something that makes all the difference. She refused to accept silence as a final answer. Every day she returned to court was an act of faith, even if she didn't realize it. It was her saying, "I deserve justice, and I'll keep asking until I receive it." And that is exactly what God sustained me in my own journey and in the journey of so many people I know. It wasn't because we were special, eloquent, or perfect, but simply because we refused to give up. The tears that God sees aren't the ones you cry once and then forget. They're the ones you shed day after day, night after night, insisting that the story hasn't ended yet and that the answer will still come. The widow teaches us that persistence isn't about strength. It's about refusing to accept no as the final word. Who was the unjust judge? Jesus describes this judge in a way that shocks any minimally religious or ethical person. He didn't fear God and didn't respect anyone. Think carefully about what this means. This man had no kind of moral break, no spiritual conscience that would make him think twice before committing an injustice. He didn't wake up in the morning thinking, "I need to do what's right today." Didn't worry if his decisions would offend God. Didn't lose sleep wondering if someone was suffering because of his unjust verdicts. He was the type of person you find in positions of power who uses that authority only for personal benefit. You know that boss who only thinks about numbers and doesn't care if employees are being exploited. Or that politician who only shows up in the community during election season. This judge was exactly like that, but with legal power to decide people's destinies. And the scariest part, he wasn't ashamed of it. He simply didn't care whether he was seen as just or unjust. This man represents the worst type of authority that can exist, one that has neither spiritual values nor human empathy. He had no fear that God would judge him for his injustices, so there was no divine fear regulating his decisions. He had no respect for people, so there was no human empathy making him put himself in the place of those who suffered. When you combine these two absences, you have a perfect recipe for total corruption. He was the type of judge who accepted bribes, who favored the rich, who ignored the poor, who deliberately delayed cases where there was no personal advantage for him. Imagine you needing urgent surgery and the doctor says he'll only see you if you pay under the table or else you wait months in line. It's revolting, isn't it? Well, that's exactly how this judge operated. He had the power to bring justice, but chose not to unless there was something in it for him. And the widow had absolutely nothing to offer. So why did he finally give in and give her the justice she was asking for? Jesus makes it very clear. It wasn't out of kindness. It wasn't out of repentance. It wasn't because he had a moment of spiritual enlightenment. It was simply because he was tired. The word Jesus uses in the original gives the idea of someone being repeatedly punched in the face. Someone who's exhausted from being bothered so much. The judge thought to himself, "Although I don't fear God or respect men, I'll give this widow justice. Because if I don't, she'll keep tormenting me until she drives me crazy." Think about the irony of this situation. A woman with no power whatsoever managed to defeat a corrupt judge using the only weapon she had: persistence. It's like the story of David and Goliath, but in legal version. She didn't have a stone and sling. She had a voice and determination. And that was enough to overcome an entire system that was against her. When God speaks to the heart about justice, he uses even the most unlikely instruments to make his will come to pass. Now comes the brilliant part of Jesus' teaching. If even a bad, corrupt, heartless, and unscrupulous judge responded, because of a widow's insistence, how much more will a just, loving, merciful, and faithful God respond to the cries of his children? Jesus is using an argument from the lesser to the greater. If the worst of judges gave in, the best of fathers will certainly respond. The difference is that the judge gave in because he was irritated, but God responds because he loves. The judge gave in to get rid of the annoyance, but God works in silence, preparing the perfect answer at the right time. The judge gave the bare minimum necessary, but God gives abundantly more than we ask or think. Do you understand what this means for your prayers that seem not to be answered? It means that if even persistence worked with someone who had no love for you, imagine what your persistence releases in the heart of a God who loves you more than you can comprehend. God heard your prayer from the first time, but sometimes he allows the wait not because he's indifferent like the judge, but because he's working on something much greater than you can see now. Why do your prayers seem not to be answered? The first reason your prayers seem not to be answered is because God is working in the right time, not in your time. Silence is not absence, and delay is not denial. Think about how it works in nature. When you plant an oak seed, you don't see a giant tree the next day. The seed is there, buried, apparently dead, showing no visible sign of life. But underground, invisible things are happening. Roots are forming, nutrients are being absorbed. The structure that will support a centuries-old tree is being built. If you dig up the seed every day to see if it's growing, you'll kill the process. Likewise, when you pray and nothing seems to happen, God is working on layers you can't see. First, he works on you, molding your character, strengthening your faith, removing things you didn't even know needed to come out. Only then does he work on the external situation, because if he gave you the answer before you were ready, you wouldn't know how to handle it. God sustained me in so many moments where I wanted a quick answer, but later I understood that he was preparing me for something much greater. The second reason is because persistence reveals true faith. Praying once is hope, praying always is faith. There's a giant difference between these two concepts. Hope is when you ask for something thinking it would be nice if it happened. Faith is when you ask for something knowing it will happen, even if it takes time. The faith Jesus seeks isn't the faith of enthusiasm, that initial excitement when you just received a prophetic word, or when you left an emotional service. That faith is easy. Everyone has it. The faith Jesus seeks is the faith of endurance, the kind that remains firm when the emotion has passed, when the enthusiasm has cooled, when everyone has already given up and advises you to do the same. Think about that athlete training for a marathon. On the first day, he's excited, full of energy, posting on social media about the new goal. But what about on the 20th day, when it's raining, when muscles ache, when no one's paying attention anymore? That S when it S revealed whether he really wants to complete the marathon or if it was just passing excitement. When God speaks to the heart about something, He's not looking for who gets excited, but rather who remains faithful. The third reason is because some answers only come after insistence. The widow in the parable didn't pray beautifully, didn't make elaborate speeches, didn't use complex theological words. She simply came back. Day after day, week after week, perhaps month after month. She returned with the same request. Give me justice against my adversary. It wasn't eloquent, but it was insistent. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was consistent. And that's exactly what we know why. Because there are things in the spiritual realm that are only released through persistence. It's not that God likes to see you suffering or that He's playing with you. It's that there are spiritual battles being fought, strongholds being torn down, doors being opened, and all of this takes time. In the book of Daniel, the prophet prayed and fasted for 3 weeks before receiving the answer. And when the angel finally appeared, he said, "From the first day you began to pray, your prayer was heard." But the prince of the kingdom of Persia resisted me for 21 days. Do you understand what this means? The answer had already been released in heaven, but there was a war happening behind the scenes. Daniel could have given up on the 10th day, the 15th day, the 20th day, but he didn't give up, and on the 21st day, the answer broke through. Here is something that needs to be crystal clear in your mind. You are not alone. God is with you in every moment of this wait. The tears that God sees aren't wasted. Each one is counted and kept. When everything seemed lost, when the diagnosis was terminal, when the company was going bankrupt, when the marriage was ending. God saw your pain and wasn't indifferent. He was working in ways you couldn't perceive. Heaven is silent, but God is working behind the scenes of your story, moving pieces, preparing people, opening doors you didn't even know existed. The question isn't whether God will answer. The question is, will you keep praying until the answer comes? Because the truth is that many people give up one day before the miracle happens. They pray with such intensity, cry so many tears, insist for so long, but give up precisely when they were about to see the manifestation. Don't be that person. Keep praying, keep believing, keep trusting that God heard your prayer and that the answer is on the way, even if you can't see it yet. The widow teaches us that persistence always wins in the end. Jesus' final question. Jesus ends this parable in a way that should make each of us stop and reflect deeply. He asks a frightening question, the kind that pulls the ground out from under your feet. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Notice that he didn't ask if he would find churches packed on Sundays, didn't ask if he would find people singing hymns or doing prayer campaigns. He asked if he would find faith. True faith, persistent faith, faith that resists time and silence. And this question wasn't asked to the Pharisees, to unbelievers, or to those who never stepped foot in a synagogue. It was asked to the disciples, to those who already followed him, who had already seen miracles, who had already experienced God's power. Why would Jesus ask such a provocative question to this audience? Because he knew that the true test of faith doesn't come when everything is going well, when miracles are happening, when prayers are answered quickly. The true test comes when heaven seems closed, when answers take time, when you pray and nothing happens. Jesus' question exposes something uncomfortable. Many people have faith while everything works, but few maintain faith when nothing works. It's easy to believe when God acts visibly, when you see doors opening, when blessings are falling like rain. But what about when everything seemed lost? And when you prayed for years and the situation only got worse? And when you fasted, cried out, wept, and remained in the same place? That's where faith is truly tested. Think about that businessman who gives an emotional testimony about how God multiplied his business. Beautiful, inspiring, wonderful. But where was his faith when the company was going bankrupt, when employees weren't getting paid, when banks were denying loans and suppliers were cutting credit? The faith Jesus seeks isn't the faith of the victory testimony. It's the faith of the valley of the shadow of death. When God speaks to the heart about a promise, the question isn't whether it will be fulfilled, but whether you'll maintain faith until it's fulfilled. Jesus was anticipating something he saw clearly. A time would come when people would have everything except persistent faith. They would have theological knowledge but wouldn't have spiritual endurance. They would know complex doctrines but would give up at the first prolonged difficulty. They would attend services religiously but would abandon prayer when it didn't bring immediate results. And aren't we seeing exactly this today? We live in a generation of instant faith, express miracles, immediate answers. If you pray today and don't see results tomorrow, you change churches, seek another prophet, question whether God really exists. The widow in the parable faced an unjust judge for an indeterminate time, with no guarantee whatsoever that she would be heard, and yet she kept coming back. Today, people can barely wait a week for an answer from God. You're not alone. God is with you in this generation of immediacy. But He's calling you to a faith of another dimension, a faith that doesn't depend on a stopwatch or calendar. Jesus' question isn't rhetorical. It demands an answer from each of us. When He returns, what will He find in you? Will He find someone who gave up because the answer took too long? Or will He find someone who's still praying, still believing, still hoping against all hope? God sustained me in so many moments where the only thing that kept me standing was the decision not to give up. Even when everything inside me screamed to stop. And looking back, I understand now, God wasn't testing whether I was strong. He was revealing what kind of faith I really had. Faith in Jesus Christ isn't about feeling that He's near. It's about knowing that He is, even when you don't feel anything. God heard your prayer from the first day. He saw every tear. He counted every sleepless night. And when He returns, He won't ask how many services you attended or how many campaigns you participated in. He'll ask, did you keep believing even when I didn't answer in your time? Because that's the faith that moves mountains, that opens closed heavens, that overcomes unjust systems and makes the impossible become possible. Practical application for today. Now, the moment has come for you to stop and ask yourself an honest question. In what area of your life did you stop praying? Be brutally honest in this answer, because self-deception doesn't solve anything. Maybe it's that relationship you asked God so much to restore, but after months without seeing change, you simply gave up and decided it was better to move on. Or maybe it's that financial situation that seemed impossible. You prayed for a while, but when the bills kept coming and the money didn't appear, you stopped asking and just started conforming to scarcity. It could also be that healing you begged for with tears in your eyes, but when the tests kept showing the same results, you silently decided to accept the illness as your destiny. The truth is, we all have at least one area where we stopped insisting, where the widow within us got tired of going back to court and decided it was unworth it anymore. But here's the question. What made you give up? Was it time? Was it exhaustion? Was it the shame of continuing to ask for the same thing? Was it someone's voice saying, "You're being too insistent"? How long has it been since you went back to the judge with that request, that S stored deep in your heart? You know that prayer you used to make every day, the one that came from your mouth with tears in your eyes, the one you were sure God would answer. When was the last time you really prayed about it? Not that quick protocol prayer, but that desperate, insistent, persistent prayer that doesn't accept a no as a final answer. The widow in the parable didn't have days off. She didn't decide, today I won't bother the judge. I'll give it a rest. No, she went every single day, and every single day she repeated the same request. Give me justice against my adversary. And the vast majority of people look at this attitude and think, what an annoying woman, how inconvenient. But Jesus looked at that same attitude and said, this is the faith I am looking for. When God speaks to the heart about something, He doesn't put an expiration date on that word. The promise remains valid even after years, even after everyone has forgotten, even after you yourself started to doubt. Maybe God isn't silent like you think. Maybe He's waiting for you to come back, not to convince Him that you deserve the answer, but to form in you the kind of character that can handle what He's about to release. Think about Joseph's story in Egypt. God gave him a dream when he was a teenager. He would be great. His brothers would bow before him. He would have authority and power. Beautiful, wonderful, exciting, but between the dream and its fulfillment, more than 20 years passed. 20 years in that time, Joseph was sold as a slave, was unjustly accused of attempted rape, was thrown in prison, was forgotten by those he helped. On how many of those days do you think Joseph thought, "Did I hear God wrong? Was that dream just my teenage imagination?" But he didn't give up, not because he was a superhero, but because something inside him refused to accept that that promise had died. And when the right time finally came, everything changed in a single day. God sustained me during Joseph's process, just as he has been sustaining you, even when you don't realize it. Here's the practical application you need to implement today. Now, at this exact moment, go back to praying about what you gave up on. It doesn't matter how long ago you stopped, doesn't matter how many times you've already asked without seeing results, doesn't matter what people will think if they know you're still praying for the same thing. The widow didn't win because she had a brilliant plan, because she was eloquent, because she had resources or influence. She won because she simply didn't give up. And if she managed to bend a corrupt and heartless judge through persistence, how much more will you be able to touch the heart of a God who loves you unconditionally? You're not alone. God is with you every second of this journey, and He won't abandon you now. God saw your pain when you cried in hiding. He heard your prayer even when you thought you were talking to yourself. He counted the tears that God sees and that no one else saw. Heaven is silent, but God is acting right now, preparing the answer that will completely change your story. The only thing He needs from you is that you don't give up, that you go back to praying, that you maintain faith in Jesus Christ even when everything around you says it's impossible. Conclusion. So, after everything you've just learned, only one question remains. What are you going to do now? Will you continue being just another person who prays when motivated and gives up when tired? Or will you become that persistent widow who simply does accept no as a final word? Because here is the truth no one likes to hear. The problem was never God being deaf to your prayers. The problem is that most people give up exactly one day before the miracle happens. They pray with intensity at the beginning, but when the answer takes time, when silence prolongs, when nothing seems to change, they simply stop. And then they wonder why God doesn't hear them when in reality they themselves chose to stop speaking. You now have in your hands powerful knowledge, a secret that can completely transform your prayer life. But knowledge without application is just useless information taking up space in your head. So I want to ask you some very direct questions, and I want you to answer with brutal honesty. What's that prayer you gave up on, that request you stored at the bottom of the chest because you were tired of not seeing results? That promise God planted in your heart, but that you decided to bury because time passed and nothing happened. When was the last time you really insisted in prayer like that widow insisted with the judge? Not that quick protocol prayer before sleeping, but that desperate, insistent, persistent prayer that doesn't accept less than the complete answer. Are you willing to go back to the court and ask again, and again, as many times as necessary until justice is done in your life? Or will you continue being just another person who knows the Bible but doesn't apply its teachings? Now, pay attention, because what I'm going to tell you could change the course of your story. The answer you waiting for has already been released in heaven. God heard your prayer from the first day. He saw every tear. He counted every sleepless night. He felt every pain in your heart. You're not alone. God is with you every second of this journey. But there's a war happening behind the scenes. There are strongholds being torn down. There are doors being opened. And all of this takes time. The question isn't whether the answer will come. The question is, will you keep praying until it comes? Because the widow taught us that persistence always wins in the end. She didn't have beauty, didn't have money, didn't have influence, didn't have anything. But she had something that overcame an entire system that was against her. She simply didn't give up, and if she managed to bend a corrupt judge through insistence, how much more will you be able to touch the heart of a God who loves you unconditionally? So here's your practical challenge for the next few days. Take that prayer you abandoned and start making it again every day. It doesn't matter if it's been 1 year, 5 years, 10 years since you stopped. It doesn't matter if people will think you're being too insistent or even fanatical. The widow faced criticism, laughter, contempt, but she didn't stop. And in the end, she won. When God speaks to the heart about a promise, that promise has no expiration date. It remains valid until it's completely fulfilled. God sustained me in so many moments when I was about to give up, and today I look back and thank Him for not stopping praying, because God saw your pain, He heard your cry, and even when everything seemed lost, He was working behind the scenes, preparing something much greater than you can imagine. Heaven is silent, but God is acting right now in your life. The tears that God sees weren't wasted. Each one is stored and will be transformed into a testimony of victory. Keep your faith in Jesus Christ unshakable, because the answer is coming, and when it comes, you'll understand why you had to wait. And if this message touched deep in your heart, if you felt that God spoke directly to you through this parable, I want to ask you 2 things. First, subscribe to this channel and activate notification bells, because I am bringing more deep teachings about Jesus' parables that will completely transform your understanding of God's Word. Second, leave a comment down below saying I won't give up. It's not superstition, it's not ritual. It's just a way for you to publicly declare the commitment you're making to God today. And who knows, maybe your comment will be exactly the motivation another person needed to also go back to praying. Share this video with that person you know is tired of waiting. Who's about to give up? Who needs to hear that it's worth continuing to pray? Because in the end, the widow won, Daniel won, Joseph won, and you will win too. Not because you're strong, but because you serve a faithful God who never ever abandons His children. Keep praying, Keep believing, keep insisting. Your victory is closer than you imagine.